Chapter 6 of the Conquest of Bread. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Enko. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Dwellings. Part 1. Those who have closely watched the growth of socialist ideas among the workers must have noticed that on one momentous question, the housing of the people, a definite conclusion is being imperceptibly arrived at. It is a fact that in the large towns of France, and in many of the smaller ones, the workers are coming gradually to the conclusion that dwelling houses are in no sense the property of those whom the state recognizes as their owners. This idea has evolved naturally in the minds of the people, and nothing will ever convince them again that the rights of property ought to extend to houses. The house was not built by its owner, it was erected, decorated, and furnished by innumerable workers in the timber yard, the brick field, and the workshop, toiling for dear life at a minimum wage. The money spent by the owner was not the product of his own toil, it was amassed, like all other riches, by paying the workers two-thirds or only a half of what was their due. Moreover, and it is here that the enormity of the whole proceeding becomes more glaring, the house owes its actual value to the profit which the owner can make out of it. Now this profit results from the fact that his house is built in a town, that is, in an agglomeration of thousands of other houses, possessing paved streets, bridges, quays, and fine public buildings, well lighted, and affording to its inhabitants a thousand comforts and conveniences unknown in villages. A town in regular communication with other towns, and itself a centre of industry, commerce, science, and art, a town which the work of 20 or 30 generations has made habitable, healthy, and beautiful. A house in certain parts of Paris is valued at many thousands of pounds sterling, not because thousands of pounds worth of labour have been expended on that particular house, but because it is in Paris, because for centuries workmen, artists, thinkers, and men of learning and letters have contributed to make Paris what it is today, a centre of industry, commerce, politics, art, and science. Because Paris has a past, because thanks to literature, the names of its streets are household words in foreign countries as well as at home, because it is the fruit of 18 centuries of toil, the work of 50 generations of the whole French nation. Who then can appropriate to himself the tiniest plot of ground or the meanest building in such a city without committing a flagrant injustice? Who then has the right to sell to any bidder the smallest portion of the common heritage? On that point, as we have said, the workers begin to be agreed. The idea of free dwellings showed its existence very plainly during the siege of Paris, when the cry was for an abatement pure and simple of the terms demanded by the landlords. It appeared again during the Commune of 1871, when the Paris workmen expected the Council of the Commune to decide boldly on the abolition of rent. And when the new revolution comes, it will be the first question with which the poor will concern themselves. Whether in time of revolution or in time of peace, the worker must be housed somehow or other. He must have some sort of roof over his head, but however tumble down and squalid his dwelling may be, there is always a landlord who can evict him. True, during the Revolution, the landlord cannot fine bailiffs and police sergeants to throw the workmen's rags and chattels into the street, but who knows what the new government will do tomorrow? Who can say that it will not call coercion to its aid again, and set the police back upon the tenant to hound him out of his hovels? Have we not seen the Commune of Paris proclaim the remission of rents due up to the 1st of April only? The decree of the 30 March. By this decree, rents due up to the terms of October 1870 and January and April 1871 were annulled. After that, rent had to be paid, though Paris was in a state of chaos, and industry at a standstill, so that the federate who had taken arms to defend the independence of Paris had absolutely nothing to depend upon, he and his family, but an allowance of 15 pence a day. Now the worker must be made to see clearly that in refusing to pay rent to a landowner or owner, he is not simply profiting by the disorganization of authority. He must understand that the abolition of rent is a recognized principle, sanctioned, so to speak, by popular assent, that to be housed rent-free is a right proclaimed aloud by the people. Are we going to wait till this measure, which is in harmony with every honest man's sense of justice, is taken up by the few socialists scattered among the middle-class elements? of which the provisionary government will be composed. If it were so, the people should have to wait long, till the return of reaction in fact. This is why, refusing uniforms and badges, those outward signs of authority and servitude, and remaining people among the people, the earnest revolutionists will work side by side with the masses, that the abolition of rent, the expropriation of houses, will become an accomplished fact. They will prepare the ground and encourage ideas to grow in this direction. And when the fruit of their labours is ripe, the people will proceed to expropriate the houses without giving heed to the theories which will certainly be thrust in their way, theories about paying compensation to landlords and finding first the necessary funds. On the day that the expropriation of houses takes place, on that day the exploited workers will have realized that new times have come, that labour will no longer have to bear the yoke of the rich and powerful, that equality has been openly proclaimed, that this revolution is a real fact and not a theatrical make-believe like so many others preceding it. Part 2. If the idea of expropriation be adopted by the people, it will be carried into effect in spite of all the insurmountable obstacles with which we are menaced. Of course, the good folk in new uniforms, seated in the official armchairs of the Hôtel de Ville, will be sure to busy themselves in heaping up obstacles. They will talk of giving compensation to the landlords, of preparing statistics and drawing up long reports. Yes, they would be capable of drawing up reports long enough to outlast the hopes of the people, who, after waiting and starving in enforced idleness and seeing nothing come of all these official researches, would lose heart and faith in the revolution and abandon the field to the reactionaries. The new bureaucracy would end by making expropriation hateful in the eyes of all. Here indeed is a rock which might shipwreck our hopes. But if the people turn a deaf ear to the specious arguments used to dazzle them, and realize that new life needs new conditions, and if they undertake the task themselves, then expropriation can be effected without any great difficulty. But how? How can it be done? You ask us. We shall try to reply to this question, but with a reservation. We have no intention of tracing out the plans of expropriation in their smallest details. We know beforehand that all that any man, or group of men, could suggest today would be far surpassed by the reality when it comes. Men will accomplish greater things, and accomplish them better and by simpler methods, than those dictated to him beforehand. Thus we shall merely indicate the manner by which expropriation might be accomplished without the intervention of government. We do not propose to go out of our way to answer those who declare that the thing is impossible. We confine ourselves to replying that we are not the upholders of any particular method of organization. We are only concerned to demonstrate that expropriation could be effected by popular initiative, and could not be effected by any other means whatever. It seems very likely that as soon as expropriation is fairly started, groups of volunteers will spring up in every district, street and block of houses, and undertake to inquire into the number of flats and houses which are empty, and of those which are overcrowded, the unwholesome slums, and the houses which are too spacious for their occupants, and might well be used to house those who are stifled in swarming tenements. In a few days these volunteers would have drawn up complete lists for the street and the district of all the flats, tenements, family mansions, and villa residences, all the rooms and suite of rooms, healthy and unhealthy, small and large, fitted dens and homes of luxury. Really communicating with each other, these volunteers would soon have their statistics complete. False statistics can be manufactured in boardrooms and offices, but true and exact statistics must begin with the individual and mount up from the simple to the complex. Then, without waiting for anyone's leave, those citizens will probably go and find their comrades who were living in miserable garrets and hovels, and will say to them simply, "It is a real revolution this time, comrades, and no mistake about it. Come to such a place this evening, all the neighborhood will be there. We are going to redistribute the dwelling houses. If you are tired of your slum garret, come and choose one of the flats of 5 rooms that are to be disposed of, and when you have once moved in, you shall stay. Never fear. The people are up in arms, and he who would venture to evict you will have to answer to them." But everyone will want a fine house or a spacious flat, we are told. No, you are quite mistaken. It is not the people's way to clamor for the moon, On the contrary, every time we have seen them set about repairing a wrong, we have been struck by the good sense and instinct for justice which animates the masses. Have we ever known them demand the impossible? Have we ever seen the people of Paris fighting among themselves while waiting for their rations of bread or firewood during the two sieges or during the terrible years of 1792 to 1794? The patience and resignation which prevailed among them in 1871 was constantly presented for admiration by the foreign press correspondents. And yet these patient waiters knew full well that the last comers would have to pass the day without food or fire. We do not deny that there are plenty of egotistic instincts in isolated individuals. We are quite aware of it, but we contend that the very way to revive and nourish these instincts would be to confine such questions as the housing of the people to any border committee, in fact to the tender mercies of officialism in any shape or form. Then indeed all the evil passions spring up, and it becomes a case of who is the most influential person on the board. The least inequality causes wranglings and recriminations. If the smallest advantage is given to anyone, a tremendous hue and cry is raised, and not without reason. But if the people themselves, organized by streets, districts and parishes, undertake to move the inhabitants of the slums into the half-empty dwellings of the middle classes, the trifling inconveniences, the little inequalities, will be easily tided over. Rarely has appeal been made to the good instincts of the masses, only as a last resort, to save the sinking ship in times of revolution. But never has such an appeal been made in vain. The heroism, the self-devotion of the toiler has never failed to respond to it, and thus it will be in the coming revolution. But when all is said and done, some inequalities, some inevitable injustices, undoubtedly will remain. There are individuals in our societies whom no great crisis can lift out of the deep mire of egoism in which they are sunk. The question, however, is not whether there will be injustices or no, but rather how to limit the number of them. Now all history, all the experience of the human race, and all social psychology unite in showing that the best and fairest way is to trust the decision to those whom it concerns most nearly. It is they alone who can consider and allow for the 101 details which must necessarily be overlooked in any merely official redistribution. Part 3. Moreover, it is by no means necessary to make straightway an absolutely equal redistribution of all the dwellings. There will no doubt be some inconveniences at first, but matters will soon be righted in a society which has adopted expropriation. When the masons and carpenters and all who are concerned in house building know that their daily bread is secured to them, they will ask nothing better than to work at their old trades a few hours a day. They will adapt the fine houses which absorb the time of a whole staff of servants for giving shelter to several families, and in a few months homes will have sprung up, infinitely healthier and more conveniently arranged than those of today. And to those who are not yet comfortably housed, the anarchist commune will be able to say, "Patience, comrades. Palaces fairer and finer than any the capitalists build for themselves will spring from the ground of our enfranchised city. They will belong to those who have most need of them." The anarchist commune does not build with an eye to revenues. These monuments erected to its citizens, products of the collective spirit, will serve as models to all humanity. They will be yours. If the people of the revolution expropriate the houses and proclaim free lodgings, the communalizing of houses and the right of each family to a decent dwelling, then the revolution will have assumed a communistic character from the first, and started on a course from which it will be by no means easy to turn it. It will have struck a fatal blow at individual property, for the expropriation of dwellings contains in germ the whole social revolution. On the manner of its accomplishment depends the character of all that follows. Either we shall start on a good road leading straight to anarchist communism, or we shall remain sticking in the mud of despotic individualism. It is easy to see the numerous objections, theoretic on the one hand, practical on the other, with which we are sure to be met. As it will be a question of maintaining inequity at any price, our opponents will of course protest in the name of justice. Is it not a crying shame, they will exclaim, that the people of Paris should take possession of all these fine houses, while the peasants in the country have only tumble-down huts to live in? But do not let us make a mistake. These enthusiasts for justice forget, by a lapse of memory to which they are subject, the crying shame which they themselves are tacitly defending. They forget that in this same city the worker, with his wife and children, suffocates in a noisome garret, while from his window he sees the rich man's palace. They forget that whole generations perish in crowded slums, starving for air and sunlight, and that to redress this injustice ought to be the first task of the revolution. Do not let this disingenuous protest hold us back. We know that any inequality which may exist between town and country in the early days of the revolution will be transitory and of a nature that will right itself from day to day. For the village will not fail to improve its dwellings as soon as the peasant has ceased to be the beast of burden of the farmer, the merchant, the money lender, and the state. In order to avoid an accidental and transitory inequality, shall we stay our hand from righting an ancient wrong? The so-called practical objections are not very formidable either. We are bidden to consider the hard case of some poor fellow who by dint of privation has contrived to buy a house just large enough to hold his family, and we are going to deprive him of his hard-earned happiness, to turn him into the street. Certainly not. If his house is only just large enough for his family, by all means let him stay there. Let him work in his little garden too. Our boys will not hinder him. Nay, they will lend him a helping hand if need be. But suppose he lets lodgings, suppose he has empty rooms in his house, then the people will make the lodger understand that he need not pay his former landlord any more rent. Stay where you are, but rent free. No more dens and collectors. Socialism has abolished all that. Or again, suppose that the landlord has a score of rooms all to himself, and some poor woman lives nearby with 5 children in one room. In that case the people would see whether, with some alterations, these empty rooms could not be converted into a suitable home for the poor woman and her 5 children. Would not that be more just and fair than to leave the mother and her 5 little ones languishing in a garret, while Sir Gorgeous Midas sat at his ease in an empty mansion? Besides, good Sir Gorgeous would probably hasten to do it of his own accord. His wife shall be delighted to be freed from half her big, unwieldy house, when there is no longer a staff of servants to keep it in order. So you are going to turn everything upside down, say the defenders of law and order. There will be no end to the evictions and removals. Would it not be better to start fresh by turning everyone out of doors and redistributing the houses by lot? Thus our critics, but we are firmly persuaded that if no government interferes in the matter, if all the changes are entrusted to these free groups which have sprung up to undertake the work, the evictions and removals will be less numerous than those which take place in 1 year under the present system, owing to the rapacity of landlords. In the first place, there are in all large towns almost enough empty houses and flats to lodge all the inhabitants of the slums. As to the palaces and streets of fine apartments, many working people would not live in them if they could. One could not keep up such houses without a large staff of servants. Their occupants would soon find themselves forced to seek less luxurious dwellings. The fine ladies would find that palaces were not well adapted to self-help in the kitchen. Gradually people would shake down. There would be no need to conduct Dives to a garret at the bayonet's point, or install Lazarus in Dives' palace by the help of an armed escort. People would shake down amicably into the available dwellings with the least possible friction and disturbance. Have we not the example of the village communes redistributing fields and disturbing the owners of the allotments so little that one can only praise the intelligence and good sense of the methods they employ? Fewer fields change hands under the management of a Russian commune than where personal property holds sway, and is forever carrying its quarrels into courts of law. And are we to believe that the inhabitants of a great European city would be less intelligent and less capable of organization than Russian or Hindu peasants? Moreover, we must not blink at the fact that every revolution means a certain disturbance to everyday life, and those who expect this tremendous climb out of the old grooves to be accomplished without so much as jarring the dishes on their dinner tables will find themselves mistaken. It is true that governments can change without disturbing worthy citizens at dinner, but the crimes of society towards those who have nourished and supported it are not to be redressed by any such political sleight of parties. Undoubtedly there will be a disturbance, but it must not be one of pure loss. It must be minimized, and again it is impossible to lay too much stress on this maxim. It will be by addressing ourselves to the interested parties and not to boards and committees that we shall best succeed in reducing the sum of inconveniences for everybody. The people commit blunder on blunder when they have to choose by ballot some harebrained candidate who solicits the honour of representing them, and takes upon himself to know all, to do all, and to organize all. But when they take upon themselves to organize what they know, what touches them directly, they do it better than all the talking shop together. Is not the Paris Commune an instance in point, and the great dockers' strike, and have we not constant evidence of this fact in every village commune? Chapter 7 of the Conquest of Bread. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Enko. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Clothing. When the houses have become the common heritage of the citizens, and when each man has his daily supply of food, another forward step will have to be taken. The question of clothing will of course demand consideration next, and again the only possible solution will be to take possession in the name of the people of all the shops and warehouses where clothing is sold or stored, and to throw open the doors to all, so that each can take what he needs. The communalization of clothing, the right of each to take what he needs from the communal stores, or to have it made for him at the tailors and outfitters, is a necessary corollary of the communalization of houses and food. Obviously we shall not need for that to despoil all citizens of their goods, to put all the garments in a heap and draw lots for them, as our critics, with equal wit and ingenuity, suggest. Let him who has a coat keep it still. Nay, if he have 10 coats, it is highly improbable that anyone will want to deprive him of them, for most folk will prefer a new coat to one that has already grazed the shoulders of some fat bourgeois, and there will be enough new garments, and to spare, without having recourse to second-hand wardrobes. If we were to take an inventory of all the clothes and stuff for clothing accumulated in the shops and stores of the large towns, we should find probably that in Paris, Lyons, Bordeaux and Marseille there was enough to enable the commune to offer garments to all the citizens of both sexes, and if all were not shooted at once, the communal outfitters would soon make good these shortcomings. We know how rapidly our great tailoring and dressmaking establishments work nowadays, provided as they are with machinery especially adapted for production on a large scale. But everyone will want a sable-lined coat or a velvet gown, exclaim our adversaries. Frankly, we do not believe it. Every woman does not dote on velvet, nor does every man dream of sable linings. Even now, if we were to ask each woman to choose her gown, we should find some to prefer a simple practical garment to all the fantastic trimmings the fashionable world affects. Tastes change with the times, and the fashion in vogue at the time of the Revolution will certainly make for simplicity. Societies, like individuals, have their hours of cowardice, but also their heroic moments, and though the society of today cuts a very poor figure, sunk in the pursuit of narrow personal interests and second-rate ideas, it wears a different air when great crises come. It has its moments of greatness and enthusiasm. Men of generous nature will gain the power which today is in the hands of jobbers. Self-devotion will spring up, and noble deeds beget their like. Even the egotists will be ashamed of hanging back, and will be drawn in spite of themselves to admire, if not to imitate, the generous and brave. The great revolution of 1793 abounds in examples of this kind, and it is always during such times of spiritual revival, as natural to societies as to individuals, that the springtide of enthusiasm sweeps humanity onwards. We do not wish to exaggerate the part played by such noble passions, nor is it upon them that we would found our ideal of society, but we are not asking too much if we expect their aid in tiding over the first and most difficult moments. We cannot hope that our daily life will be continuously inspired by such exalted enthusiasms, but we may expect their aid at the first, and that is all we need. It is just to wash the earth clean, to sweep away the shards and refuse accumulated by centuries of slavery and oppression, that the new anarchist society will have need of this wave of brotherly love. Later on it can exist without appealing to the spirit of self-sacrifice, because it will have eliminated oppression, and thus created a new world instinct with all the feelings of solidarity. Besides, should the character of a revolution be such as we have sketched here, the free initiative of individuals would find an extensive field of action in thwarting the efforts of the egotists. Groups would spring up in every street and quarter to undertake the charge of the clothing. They would make inventories of all that the city possessed, and would find out approximately what were the resources at their disposal. It is more than likely than in the matter of clothing, the citizens would adopt the same principle as in the matter of provisions. That is to say, they would offer freely from the common store everything which was to be found in abundance, and dole out whatever was limited in quantity. Not being able to offer to each man a sable-lined coat, and to every woman a velvet gown, society would probably distinguish between the superfluous and the necessary, and provisionally at least class sable and velvet among the superfluities of life, ready to let time prove whether what is a luxury today may not become common to all tomorrow. While the necessary clothing would be guaranteed to each inhabitant of the anarchist city, it would be left to private activity to provide for the sick and feeble those things provisionally considered as luxuries, and to procure for the less robust such special articles as would not enter into the daily consumption of ordinary citizens. But it may be urged, this means great uniformity and the end of everything beautiful in life and art. Certainly not, we reply, and still basing our reasonings on what already exists, we are going to show how an anarchist society could satisfy the most artistic tastes of its citizens without allowing them to amass the fortunes of millionaires. Chapter 8 of the Conquest of Bread. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Enko. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Ways and Means. Part 1. If a society, a city or a territory were to guarantee the necessaries of life to its inhabitants, open bracket, and we shall see how the conception of the necessaries of life can be so extended as to include luxuries, close bracket, it would be compelled to take possession of what is absolutely needed for production, that is to say, land, machinery, factories, means of transport, etc. Capital in the hands of private owners would be expropriated, to be returned to the community. The great harm done by bourgeois society, as we have already mentioned, is not only that capitalists seize a large share of the profits of each industrial and commercial enterprise, thus enabling themselves to live without working, but that all production has taken a wrong direction, as it is not carried on with a view to securing well-being to all. There is the reason why it must be condemned. It is absolutely impossible that mercantile production should be carried on in the interest of all. To desire it would be to expect the capitalist to go beyond his province and to fulfill duties that he cannot fulfill without ceasing to be what he is, a private manufacturer seeking his own enrichment. Capitalist organization, based on the personal interest of each individual employer of labor, has given to society all that could be expected of it. It has increased the productive force of labor. The capitalist, profiting by the revolution effected in industry by steam, by the sudden development of chemistry and machinery, and by other inventions of our century, has worked in his own interest to increase the yield of human labor, and in a great measure he has succeeded so far. But to attribute other duties to him would be unreasonable. For example, to expect that he should use this superior yield of labor in the interest of society as a whole would be to ask philanthropy and charity of him. And a capitalist enterprise cannot be based on charity. It now remains for society, first, to extend this greater productivity, which is limited to certain industries, and to apply it to the general good. But it is evident that to utilize this high productivity of labor so as to guarantee well-being to all, society must itself take possession of all means of production. Economists, as is their wont, will not fail to remind us of the comparative well-being of a certain category of young robust workmen, skilled in certain special branches of industry, which has been obtained under the present system. It is always this minority that is pointed out to us with pride. But even this well-being, which is the exclusive right of a few, is it secure? Tomorrow maybe negligence, improvidence, or the greed of their employers will deprive these privileged men of their work, and they will pay for the period of comfort they have enjoyed with months and years of poverty or destitution. How many important industries, the textiles, iron, sugar, etc., without mentioning all sorts of short-lived trades, have we not seen decline or come to a standstill on account of speculations or in consequence of natural displacement of work, or from the effects of competition amongst the capitalists themselves? If the chief textile and mechanical industries had to pass through such a crisis as they have passed through in 1886, we hardly need mention the small trades, all of which have their periods of standstill. What too shall we say to the price which is paid for the relative well-being of certain categories of workmen? Unfortunately, it is paid for by the ruin of agriculture, the shameless exploitation of the peasants, the misery of the masses. In comparison with the feeble minority of workers who enjoy a certain comfort, how many millions of human beings live from hand to mouth, without a secure wage, ready to go wherever they are wanted? How many peasants work 14 hours a day for a poor pittance? Capital depopulates the country, exploits the colonies and the countries where industries are but little developed, dooms the immense majority of workmen to remain without technical education, to remain mediocre even in their own trade. This is not merely accidental. It is a necessity of the capitalist system. In order well to remunerate certain classes of workmen, peasants must become the beasts of burden of society. The country must be deserted for the town. Small trades must agglomerate in the foul suburbs of large cities, and manufacture 1,000 little things for next to nothing, so as to bring the goods of the greater industries within reach of buyers with small salaries. That bad cloth may be sold to ill-paid workers. Garments are made by tailors who are satisfied with a starvation wage. Eastern lands in a backward state are exploited by the West, in order that, under the capitalist system, workers in a few privileged industries may obtain certain limited comforts of life. The evil of the present system is therefore not that the surplus value of production goes to the capitalists, as Rothbertus and Marx said, thus narrowing the socialist conception and the general view of the capitalist system. The surplus value itself is but a consequence of deeper causes. The evil lies in the possibility of a surplus value existing, instead of a simple surplus not consumed by each generation. For that a surplus value should exist means that men, women and children are compelled by hunger to sell their labor for a small part of what this labor produces, and still more so, of what their labor is capable of producing. But this evil will last as long as the instruments of production belong to the few, as long as men are compelled to pay heavy tribute to property holders for the right of cultivating land or putting machinery into action, and the owners of the land and the machines are free to produce what bids fair to bring them in the largest profits, rather than the greatest amount of useful commodities. Well-being can only be temporarily guaranteed to a very few. It is only to be bought by the poverty of a large section of society. It is not sufficient to distribute the profits realized by a trade in equal parts. If at the same time thousands of other workers are exploited, it is a case of producing the greatest amount of goods necessary to the well-being of all, with the least possible waste of human energy. This generalized aim cannot be the aim of a private owner, and this is why society as a whole, if it takes this view of production as its ideal, will be compelled to expropriate all that enhances well-being while producing wealth. It will have to take possession of land, factories, mines, means of communication, etc., and besides, it will have to study what products will promote general well-being, as well as the ways and means of an adequate production. Part 2. How many hours a day will man have to work to produce nourishing food, a comfortable home, and necessary clothing for his family? This question has often preoccupied socialists, and they generally came to the conclusion that 4 or 5 hours a day would suffice, on condition, be it well understood, that all men work. At the end of last century, Benjamin Franklin fixed the limit at 5 hours, and if the need of comfort is greater now, the power of production has augmented too, and far more rapidly. In speaking of agriculture further on, we shall see what the earth can be made to yield to man when he cultivates it in a reasonable way, instead of throwing seed haphazard in a badly ploughed soil, as he mostly does today. In the great farms of Western America, some of which cover 30 square miles, but have a poorer soil than the manured soil of civilized countries, only 10 to 15 English bushels per English acre are obtained, that is to say, half the yield of European farms or of American farms in the eastern states. And nevertheless, thanks to machines which enable 2 men to plough 4 English acres a day, 100 men can produce in a year all that is necessary to deliver the bread of 10,000 people at their homes during a whole year. Thus it would suffice for a man to work under the same conditions for 30 hours, say 6 half days of 5 hours each, to have bread for a whole year, and to work 30 half days to guarantee the same to a family of 5 people. We shall also prove by results obtained nowadays that if we took recourse to intensive agriculture, less than 6 half days' work could procure bread, meat, vegetables, and even luxurious food for a whole family. Again, if we study the cost of workmen's dwelling built in large towns today, we can ascertain that to obtain in a large English city a semi-detached little house, as they are built for workmen for £250, from 1400 to 1800 half days' work of 5 hours would be sufficient, And as a house of that kind lasts 50 years at least, it follows that 28 to 36 half-days work a year would provide well-furnished, healthy quarters with all necessary comfort for a family. Whereas, when hiring the same apartment from an employer, a workman pays from 75 to 100 days work per year. Mark that these figures represent the maximum of what a house costs in England today, being given the defective organization of our societies. In Belgium, workmen's houses in the city over here have been built at a much smaller cost, so that taking everything into consideration, we are justified in affirming that in a well-organized society, 30 or 40 half-days work a year will suffice to guarantee a perfectly comfortable home. There now remains clothing, the exact value of which is almost impossible to fix, because the profits realized by a swarm of middlemen cannot be estimated. Let us take cloth for example, and add up all the tribute levied on every yard of it by the landowners, the sheep owners, the wool merchants, and all their intermediate agents, then by the railway companies, mill owners, weavers, dealers in ready-made clothes, sellers and commission agents, and we shall get then an idea of what we pay to a whole swarm of capitalists for each article of clothing. That is why it is perfectly impossible to say how many days' work an overcoat that you pay £3 or £4 for in a large London shop represents. What is certain is that with present machinery it is possible to manufacture an incredible amount of goods both cheaply and quickly. A few examples will suffice. Thus in the United States, in 751 cotton mills (open bracket for spinning and weaving, close bracket), 175,000 men and women produce 2,033,000,000 yards of cotton goods, besides a great quantity of thread. On the average, more than 12,000 yards of cotton goods alone are obtained by a 300 days' work of 9½ hours each, say 40 yards of cotton in 10 hours. Admitting that a family needs 200 yards a year at most, this would be equivalent to 50 hours' work, say 10 half-days of 5 hours each, and we should have thread besides, that is to say cotton to sew with and thread to weave cloth with, so as to manufacture woolen stuffs mixed with cotton. As to the results obtained by weaving alone, the official statistics of the United States teach us that in 1870, if workmen worked 13 or 14 hours a day, they made 10,000 yards of white cotton goods in a year. 16 years later, open bracket 1886, close bracket, they were 30,000 yards by working only 55 hours a week. Even in printed cotton goods, they obtained, weaving and printing included, 32,000 yards in 2,670 hours of work a year, say about 12 yards an hour. Thus to have your 200 yards of white and printed cotton goods, 17 hours work a year would suffice. It is necessary to remark that raw material reaches these factories in about the same state as it comes from the fields, and that the transformation gone through by the piece before it is converted into goods are completed in the course of these 17 hours. But to buy these 200 yards from the tradesman, a well-paid workman must give at the very least 10 to 15 days' work of 10 hours each, say 100 to 150 hours. And as to the English peasant, he would have to toil for a month, or a little more, to obtain this luxury. By this example, we already see that by working 50 half-days per year, in a well-organized society, we could dress better than the lower middle classes do today. But with all this we have only required 60 half-days' work of 5 hours each to obtain the fruits of the earth, 40 for housing and 50 for clothing, which only makes half a year's work, as the year consists of 300 working days if we deduct holidays. There remains still 150 half-days' work, which could be made use of for other necessaries of life: wine, sugar, coffee, tea, furniture, transport, etc., etc. It is evident that these calculations are only approximative, but they can also be proved in another way. When we take into account how many in the so-called civilized nations produce nothing, how many work at harmful trades doomed to disappear, and lastly, how many are only useless middlemen, we see that in each nation the number of real producers could be doubled, and if instead of every 10 men 20 were occupied in producing useful commodities, and if society took the trouble to economize human energy, those 20 people would only have to work 5 hours a day without production decreasing, and it would suffice to reduce the waste of human energy which is going on in the rich families with the scores of useless servants, or in the administrations which occupy one official to every 10 or even 6 inhabitants, and to utilize those forces to augment immensely the productivity of a nation. In fact, work could be reduced to 4 or even 3 hours a day to produce all the goods that are produced now. After studying all these facts together, we may arrive then at the following conclusion. Imagine a society comprising a few million inhabitants, engaged in agriculture and a great variety of industries. Paris, for example, with the department of Seine-et-Oise. Suppose that in this society all children learn to work with their hands as well as with their brains. Admit that all adults, save women, engaged in the education of their children, bind themselves to work 5 hours a day from the age of 20 or 22 to 45 or 50, and that they follow occupations they have chosen themselves in any one of those branches of human work which in this city are considered necessary. Such a society could in return guarantee well-being to all its members, a well-being more substantial than that enjoyed today by the middle classes, and moreover, each worker belonging to this society would have at his disposal at least 5 hours a day which he could devote to science, art and individual needs which do not come under the category of necessities, but will probably do so later on, when man's productivity will have augmented, and those objects will no longer appear luxurious or inaccessible. Chapter 9 of the Conquest of Bread. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Enko. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. The Need for Luxury. Part 1. Man is not a being whose exclusive purpose in life is eating, drinking, and providing a shelter for himself. As soon as his material wants are satisfied, other needs, which generally speaking may be described as of an artistic character, will thrust themselves forward. These needs are of the greatest variety. They vary with each and every individual, and the more society is civilized, the more will individuality be developed, and the more will desires be varied. Even today, we see men and women denying themselves necessaries to acquire mere trifles, to obtain some particular gratification, or some intellectual or material enjoyment. A Christian or an ascetic may disapprove of these desires for luxury, but it is precisely these trifles that break the monotony of existence and make it agreeable. Would life, with all its inevitable drudge and sorrows, be worth living if besides daily work man could never obtain a single pleasure according to his individual tastes? If we wish for a social revolution, it is no doubt first of all to give bread to everyone, to transform this execrable society in which we can every day see capable workmen dangling their arms for want of an employer who will exploit them, women and children wandering shelterless at night, whole families reduced to dry bread, men, women and children dying for want of care and even for want of food. It is to put an end to these iniquities that we rebel. But we expect more from the revolution. We see that the worker, compelled to struggle painfully for bare existence, is reduced to ignore the higher delights, the highest within man's reach of science, and especially of scientific discovery, of art, and especially of artistic creation. It is in order to obtain for all of us joys that are now reserved to a few, in order to give leisure and the possibility of developing everyone's intellectual capacities, that the social revolution must guarantee daily bread to all. After bread has been secured, leisure is the supreme aim. No doubt nowadays, when hundreds and thousands of human beings are in need of bread, coal, clothing and shelter, luxury is a crime. To satisfy it, the worker's child must go without bread. But in a society in which all have the necessary food and shelter, the needs which we consider luxuries today will be the more keenly felt. And as all men do not and cannot resemble one another, open bracket, the variety of tastes and needs is the chief guarantee of human progress, close bracket, there will always be, and it is desirable that there should always be, men and women whose desire will go beyond those of ordinary individuals in some particular direction. Everybody does not need a telescope, because even if learning the general, there are people who prefer to examine things through a microscope to studying the starry heavens. Some like statues, some like pictures. A particular individual has no other ambition than to possess a good piano, while another is pleased with an accordion. The tastes vary, but the artistic need exists in all. In our present poor capitalistic society, the man who has artistic needs cannot satisfy them unless he is heir to a large fortune, or by dint of hard work appropriates to himself an intellectual capital which will enable him to take up a liberal profession. Still he cherishes the hope of some day satisfying his tastes more or less, and for this reason he reproaches the idealist communist societies with having the material life of each individual as their sole aim. In your communal stores you may perhaps have bread for all, he says to us, but you will not have beautiful pictures, optical instruments, luxurious furniture, artistic jewelry, in short, the many things that minister to the infinite variety of human tastes, and you suppress the possibility of obtaining anything besides the bread and meat which the commune can offer to all, and the drab linen in which all your lady citizens will be dressed. These are the objections which all communist systems have to consider, and which the founders of new societies, established in American deserts, never understood. They believe that if a community could procure sufficient cloth to dress all its members, a music room in which the brothers could strum a piece of music, or act a play from time to time, it was enough. They forgot that the feeling for art existed in the agriculturist as well as in the burgher, and notwithstanding that the expression of artistic feeling varies according to the difference in culture, in the main it remains the same. In vain did the community guarantee the common necessaries of life. In vain did it suppress all education that would tend to develop individuality. In vain did it eliminate all reading save the Bible. Individual taste broke forth and caused general discontent. Quarrels arose when somebody proposed to buy a piano or scientific instruments, and the elements of progress flagged. The society could only exist on condition that it crushed all individual feeling, all artistic tendency, and all development. Will the anarchist commune be impelled by the same direction? Evidently not, if it understands that while it produces all that is necessary to material life, it must also strive to satisfy all manifestations of the human mind. Part 2. We frankly confess that when we think of the abyss of poverty and suffering that surrounds us, when we hear the heart-rending cry of the worker walking the streets begging for work, we are loth to discuss the question: how will men act in a society whose members are properly fed to satisfy certain individuals desirous of possessing a piece of Sèvres china or a velvet dress? We are tempted to answer: let us make sure of bread to begin with. We shall see to china and velvet later on. But as we must recognize that man has other needs besides food, and as the strength of anarchy lies precisely in that it understands all human faculties and all passions, and ignores none, we shall in a few words explain how man can contrive to satisfy all his intellectual and artistic needs. We have already mentioned that by working 4 or 5 hours a day, till the age of 45 or 50, man could easily produce all that is necessary to guarantee comfort to society. But the day's work of a man accustomed to toil does not consist of 5 hours. It is a 10-hour day for 300 days a year, and lasts all his life. Of course, when a man is harnessed to a machine, his health is soon undermined and his intelligence is blunted. But when man has the possibility of varying occupations, and especially of alternating manual with intellectual work, he can remain occupied without fatigue, and even with pleasure, for 10 or 12 hours a day. Consequently, the man who will have done the 4 or 5 hours of manual work that are necessary for his existence will have before him 5 or 6 hours, which he will seek to employ according to his taste. And these 5 or 6 hours a day will fully enable him to procure for himself, if he associates with others, all he wishes for, in addition to the necessaries guaranteed to all. He will discharge first his stock in the field, the factory and so on, which he owes to society, as his contribution to the general production, and he will employ the second half of his day, his week or his year, to satisfy his artistic or scientific needs, or his hobbies. Thousands of societies will spring up to gratify every taste and every possible fancy. Some, for example, will give their hours of leisure to literature. They will then form groups comprising authors, compositors, printers, engravers, draftsmen, all pursuing a common aim, the propagation of ideas that are dear to them. Nowadays an author knows that there is a beast of burden, the worker, to whom for the sum of a few shillings a day he can entrust the printing of his books, but he hardly cares to know what a printing office is like. If the compositor suffers from lead poisoning, and if a child who sees to the machine dies of anemia, are there not other poor wretches to replace them? But when there will be no more starvelings ready to sell their work for a pittance, when the exploited worker of today will be educated, and will have his own ideas to put down in black and white and to communicate to others, then the authors and scientific men will be compelled to combine among themselves and with the printers in order to bring out their prose and their poetry. So long as men consider fustian and manual labour a mark of inferiority, it will appear amazing to them to see an author setting up his own book in type. For has he not a gymnasium or games by way of diversion? But when the opprobrium connected with manual labour has disappeared, when all will have to work with their hands, there being no one to do it for them, then the authors, as well as their admirers, will soon learn the art of handling composing sticks and type. They will know the pleasure of coming together, all admirers of the work to be printed, to set up the type, to shape it into pages, to take it in its virginal purity from the press. These beautiful machines, instruments of torture to the child who attends on them from morn till night, will be a source of enjoyment for those who will make use of them in order to give voice to the thoughts of their favorite author. Will literature lose by it? Will the poet be less a poet after having worked out of doors or help with his hands to multiply his work? Will the novelist lose his knowledge of human nature after having rubbed shoulders with other men in the forest or the factory, in the laying out of a road or on a railway line? Can there be two answers to these questions? Maybe some books will be less voluminous, but then more will be said on fewer pages. Maybe fewer waste sheets will be published, but the matter printed will be more attentively read and more appreciated. The book will appeal to a larger circle of better educated readers who will be more competent to judge. Moreover, the art of printing, that has so little progress since Gutenberg, is still in its infancy. It takes 2 hours to compose in type what is written in 10 minutes, but more expeditious methods of multiplying thought are being sought after and will be discovered. Open footnote. They have already been discovered since the above lines were written. Close footnote. What a pity every author does not have to take his share in the printing of his works. What progress printing would have already made. We should no longer be using movable letters, as in the 17th century. Part 3. Is it a dream to conceive a society in which, all having become producers, all having received an education that enables them to cultivate science or art, and all having leisure to do so, men would combine to publish the works of their choice, by contributing each his share of manual work? We have already hundreds of learned, literary, and other societies, and these societies are nothing but voluntary groups of men, interested in certain branches of learning, and associated for the purpose of publishing their works. The authors who write for the periodicals of these societies are not paid, and their periodicals, apart from a limited number of copies, are not for sale. They are sent gratis to all quarters of the globe to other societies cultivating the same branches of learning. This member of the society may insert in its review a one-page note summarizing his observations. Another may publish therein an extensive work, the results of long years of study, while others will confine themselves to consulting the review as a starting point for further research. It doesn't matter, all these authors and readers are associated for the production of works in which all of them take an interest. It is true that a learned society, like the individual author, goes to a printing office where workmen are engaged to do the printing. Nowadays, those who belong to the learned societies despise manual labor, which indeed is carried on under very bad conditions. But a community which would give a generous philosophic and scientific education to all its members would know how to organize manual labor in such a way that it would be the pride of humanity. Its learned societies would become associations of explorers, lovers of science and workers, all knowing a manual trade and all interested in science. If, for example, the society is studying geology, all will contribute to the exploration of the Earth's strata. Each member will take his share in research, and 10,000 observers, where we have now only 100, will do more in a year than we can do in 20 years. And when their works are to be published, 10,000 men and women, skilled in different trades, will be ready to draw maps, engrave designs, compose and print the books. With gladness will they give their leisure in summer to exploration, in winter to indoor work, and when their works appear, they will find not only 100, but 10,000 readers interested in their common work. This is the direction in which progress is already moving. Even today, when England felt the need of a complete dictionary of the English language, the birth of a literate who would devote his life to this work was not waited for. Volunteers were appealed to, and 1,000 men offered their services spontaneously and gratuitously to ransack the libraries, to take notes, and to accomplish in a few years a work which one man could not complete in his lifetime. In all branches of human intelligence, the same spirit is breaking forth, and we should have a very limited knowledge of humanity could we not guess that the future is announcing itself in such tentative cooperation, which is gradually taking the place of individual work. For this dictionary to be a really collective work, it would have been necessary that many volunteer authors, printers and printers' readers should have work in common. But something in this direction is done already in the socialist press, which offers us examples of manual and intellectual work combined. It happens in our newspapers that a socialist author composes in lead his own article. True, such attempts are rare, but they indicate in which direction evolution is going. They show the road of liberty. In future, when a man will have something useful to say, a word that goes beyond the thought of his century. He will not have to look for an editor who might advance the necessary capital. He will look for collaborators among those who know the printing trade and who approve the idea of his new work. Together they will publish the new book or journal. Literature and journalism will cease to be a means of money making and living at the cost of others. But is there anyone who knows literature and journalism from within, and who does not ardently desire that literature should at last be able to free itself from those who formerly protected it and who now exploit it, and from the multitude which, with rare exceptions, pays for it in proportion to its mediocrity, or to the ease with which it adapts itself to the bad taste of a greater number? Letters and science will only take their proper place in the work of human development when, freed from all mercenary bondage, they will be exclusively cultivated by those who love them, and for those who love them. Part 4. Literature, science and art must be cultivated by freemen. Only on this condition will they succeed in emancipating themselves from the yoke of the state, of capital, and of the bourgeois mediocrity which stifles them. What means has the scientist of today to make researches that interest him? Should he ask help of the state, which can only be given to one candidate in 100, and which only he may obtain who promises ostensibly to keep to the beaten track? Let us remember how the Academy of Sciences of France repudiated Darwin, how the Academy of St. Petersburg treated Mendeleev with contempt, and how the Royal Society of London refused to publish Joule's paper, in which he determined the mechanical equivalent of heat, finding it unscientific. We know this from Playfair, who mentioned it at Joule's death. It was why all great researches, all discoveries revolutionizing science, have been made outside academies and universities, either by men rich enough to remain independent, like Darwin and Lyell, or by men who undermine their health by working in poverty, and often in great straits, losing endless time for want of a laboratory, and unable to procure the instruments or books necessary to continue their researches, but persevering against hope, and often dying before they had reached the end in view. Their name is legion. Altogether, the system of help granted by the state is so bad that science has always endeavoured to emancipate itself from it. For this very reason, there are thousands of learned societies organized and maintained by volunteers in Europe and America, some having developed to such a degree that all the resources of subventioned societies and all the wealth of millionaires would not buy their treasures. No governmental institution is as rich as the Zoological Society of London, which is supported by voluntary contributions. It does not buy the animals which in thousand peoples its gardens. They are sent by other societies and by collectors of the entire world. The Zoological Society of Bombay will send an elephant as a gift. Another time a hippopotamus or a rhinoceros is offered by Egyptian naturalists. And these magnificent presents are pouring in every day, arriving from all quarters of the globe: birds, reptiles, collections of insects, etc. Such consignments often comprise animals that could not be bought for all the gold in the world. Thus a traveller who has captured an animal at life's peril, and now loves it as he would love a child, will give it to the society because he is sure it will be cared for. The entrance fee paid by visitors, and they are numberless, suffices for the maintenance of that immense institution. What is defective in the Zoological Society of London, and in other kindred societies, is that the members' fee cannot be paid in work, that the keepers and numerous employees of this large institution are not recognized as members of the society, while many have no other incentive to joining the society than to put the cabalistic letters FZS Fellow of the Zoological Society on their cards. In a word, what is needed is a more perfect cooperation. We may say the same about inventors that we have said of scientists. Who does not know what sufferings nearly all great inventions have cost? Sleepless nights, families deprived of bread, want of tools and materials for experiments. This is the history of nearly all those who have enriched industry with inventions which are the truly legitimate pride of our civilization. But what are we to do to alter the conditions that everybody is convinced are bad? Patents have been tried, and we know with what results. The inventor sells his patent for a few pounds, and the man who has only lent the capital pockets the enormous profits often resulting from the invention. Besides, patents isolate the inventor. They compel him to keep secret his researches, which therefore end in failure, whereas the simplest suggestion, coming from a brain less absorbed in the fundamental idea, sometimes suffices to fertilize the invention and make it practical. Like all state control, Patents hamper the progress of industry. Thought being incapable of being patented, patents are a crying injustice in theory, and in practice they result in one of the great obstacles to the rapid development of invention. What is needed to promote the spirit of invention is, first of all, the awakening of thought, the boldness of conception, which our entire education causes to languish. It is the spreading of a scientific education which would increase the number of inquirers 100-fold. It is faith that humanity is going to take a step forward, because it is enthusiasm, the hope of doing good, that has inspired all the great inventors. The social revolution alone can give this impulse to thought, this boldness, this knowledge, this conviction of working for all. Then we shall have vast institutes supplied with motor power and tools of all sorts, immense industrial laboratories open to all inquirers, where men will be able to work out their dreams after having acquitted themselves of their duty towards society, machinery palaces, where they will spend their 5 or 6 hours of leisure, where they will make their experiments, where they will find other comrades, experts in other branches of industry, likewise coming to study some difficult problem, and therefore able to help and enlighten each other. The encounter of their ideas and experience, causing the longed-for solution to be found. And yet again this is no dream. Solomon Gorodok in Petersburg has already partially realized it as regards technical matters. It is a factory well furnished with tools and free to all. Tools and motor power are supplied gratis. Only metals and wood are charged for at cost price. Unfortunately, workmen only go there at night, when worn out by 10 hours' labor in the workshop. Moreover, they carefully hide their invention from each other, as they are hampered by patents and capitalism, that bane of present society, that stumbling block in the path of intellectual and moral progress. Part 5. And what about art? From all sides we hear lamentations about the decadence of art. We are indeed far behind the great masters of the Renaissance. The technicalities of art have recently made great progress. Thousands of people, gifted with a certain amount of talent, cultivate every branch, but art seems to fly from civilization. Technicalities make headway, but inspiration frequents artists' studios less than ever. Where indeed should it come from? Only a grand idea can inspire art. Art is in our ideal synonymous with creation. It must look ahead, but save a few rare, very rare exceptions, the professional artist remains too philistine to perceive new horizons. Moreover, this inspiration cannot come from books, it must be drawn from life, and present society cannot arouse it. Raphael and Murillo painted at a time when the search of a new ideal could be pursued while retaining the old religious traditions. They painted to decorate churches, which themselves represented the pious work of several generations of a given city. The basilic, with its mysterious aspect, its grandeur, was connected with the life itself of the city, and could inspire a painter. He worked for a popular monument. He spoke to his fellow citizens, and in return he received inspiration. He appealed to the multitude in the same way as did the nave, the pillars, the stained windows, the statues, and the carved doors. Nowadays the greatest honour a painter can aspire to is to see his canvas, framed in gilded wood, hung in a museum, a sort of old curiosity shop, where you see, as in the Prado, Murillo's Ascension next to a beggar of Velasquez and the dogs of Philip II. Poor Velasquez and poor Murillo, poor Greek statues which live in the acropolis of their cities, and are now stifled beneath the red cloth hangings of the Louvre. When a Greek sculptor chiseled his marble, he endeavored to express the spirit and heart of a city. All its passions, all its traditions of glory, were to live again in the work. But today the united city has ceased to exist. There is no more communion of ideas. The town is a chance agglomeration of people who do not know one another, who have no common interest, save that of enriching themselves at the expense of one another. The fatherland does not exist. What fatherland can the international banker and the rag picker have in common? Only when cities, territories, nations, or groups of nations will have renewed their harmonious life, will art be able to draw its inspiration from ideals held in common. Then will the architect conceive the city's monument, which will no longer be a temple, a prison, or a fortress. Then will the painter, the sculptor, the carver, the ornament worker know where to put their canvases, their statues, and their decoration, deriving their power of execution from the same vital source, and gloriously marching all together towards the future. But till then art can only vegetate. The best canvases of modern artists are those that represent nature, villages, valleys, the sea with its dangers, the mountain with its splendors. But how can the painter express the poetry of work in the fields if he has only contemplated it, imagined it, if he has never delighted in it himself, if he only knows it as a bird of passage knows the country he soars over in his migrations, if in the vigour of early youth he has not followed the plough at dawn, and enjoyed mowing grass with a large sweep of the scythe next to hardy haymakers, vying in energy with lively young girls who fill the air with their songs? The love of the soil and of what grows on it is not acquired by sketching with a paintbrush, it is only in its service. And without loving it, how paint it? This is why all that the best painters have produced in this direction is still so imperfect, not true to life, nearly always merely sentimental. There is no strength in it. You must have seen a sunset when returning from work. You must have been a peasant among peasants to keep the splendor of it in your eye. You must have been at sea with fishermen at all hours of the day and night. Have fished yourself, struggled with the waves, faced the storm, and after rough work experienced the joy of hauling a heavy net, or the disappointment of seeing it empty. To understand the poetry of fishing, you must have spent time in a factory, known the fatigues and the joys of creative work, forged metals by the vivid light of a blast furnace, have felt the life in a machine. To understand the power of man and to express it in a work of art, you must in fact be permeated with popular feelings to describe them. Besides, the works of future artists who will have lived the life of the people, like the great artists of the past, will not be destined for sale. They will be an integral part of a living whole that would not be complete without them, any more than they would be complete without it. Men will go to the artist's own city to gaze at his work, and the spirited and serene beauty of such creations will produce its beneficial effect on heart and mind. Art, in order to develop, must be bound up with industry by 1,000 intermediate degrees, blended, so to say, as Ruskin and the great socialist poet Morris have proved so often and so well. Everything that surrounds man, in the street, in the interior and exterior of public monuments, must be of a pure artistic form. But this can only be realized in a society in which all enjoy comfort and leisure. Then only shall we see art associations, of which each member will find room for his capacity. For art cannot dispense with an infinity of purely manual and technical supplementary works. These artistic associations will undertake to embellish the houses of their members, as those kind volunteers, the young painters of Edinburgh, did in decorating the walls and ceilings of a great hospital for the poor in their city. A painter or sculptor who has produced a work of personal feeling will offer it to the woman he loves, or to a friend, executed for love's sake. Will his work, inspired by love, be inferior to the art that today satisfies the vanity of the Philistine, because it has cost much money? The same will be done as regards all pleasures not comprised in the necessaries of life. He who wishes for a grand piano will enter the association of musical instrument makers, and by giving the association part of his half-day's leisure, he will soon possess the piano of his dreams. If he is fond of astronomical studies, he will join the association of astronomers, with its philosophers, its observers, its calculators, with its artists in astronomical instruments, its scientists and amateurs, and he will have the telescope he desires by taking his share of the associated work, for it is especially the rough work that is needed in an astronomical observatory: bricklayers, carpenters, founders, mechanics' work, the last touch being given to the instrument of precision by the artist. In short, the 5 or 7 hours a day which each will have at his disposal, after having consecrated several hours to the production of necessities, would amply suffice to satisfy all longings for luxury, however varied. Thousands of associations would undertake to supply them. What is now the privilege of an insignificant minority would be accessible to all. Luxury, ceasing to be a foolish and ostentatious display of the bourgeois class, would become an artistic pleasure. Everyone would be the happier for it. In collective work, performed with a light heart to attain a desired end, a book, a work of art, or an object of luxury, each will find an incentive and the necessary relaxation that makes life pleasant. In working to put an end to the division between master and slave, we work for the happiness of both, for the happiness of humanity. Chapter 10 of the Conquest of Bread. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anchor. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Agreeable Work. Part 1. When socialists maintain that a society, freed from the rule of a capitalist, would make work agreeable and would suppress all repugnant and unhealthy drudgery, they are laughed at. And yet even today we can see the striking progress that is being made in this direction, and wherever this progress has been achieved, employers congratulate themselves on the economy of energy obtained thereby. It is evident that a factory could be made as healthy and pleasant as a scientific laboratory, and it is no less evident that it would be advantageous to make it so. In a spacious and well-ventilated factory, the work is better. It is easy to introduce many small ameliorations, of which each represents an economy of time or of manual labor. And if most of the workshops we know are foul and unhealthy, it is because the workers are of no account in the organization of factories, and because the most absurd waste of human energy is the distinctive feature of the present industrial organization. Nevertheless, now and again, we already find, even now, some factories so well managed that it would be a real pleasure to work in them, if the work, be it well understood, were not to last more than 4 or 5 hours a day, and if everyone had the possibility of varying it according to his taste. There are immense works, which I know, in one of the Midland counties, unfortunately consecrated to engines of war. They are perfect as regards sanitary and intelligent organization. They occupy 50 English acres of land, 15 of which are roofed with glass. The pavement of fireproof bricks is as clean as that of a miner's cottage, and the glass roof is carefully cleaned by a gang of workmen who do nothing else. In these works are forged steel ingots or blooms weighing as much as 20 tons, and when you stand 30 feet from the immense furnace, whose flames have a temperature of more than 1,000 degrees, you do not guess its presence, save when its great doors open to let out a steel monster, and the monster is handled by only 3 or 4 workmen, who now here, now there, open a tap causing immense cranes to move one way or another by the pressure of water. You enter these works expecting to hear the deafening noise of stampers, and you find that there are no stampers. The immense 100-ton guns and the crankshafts of transatlantic steamers are forged by hydraulic pressure, and the worker has but to turn a tap to give shape to the immense mass of steel, which makes a far more homogeneous metal, without crack or flaw of the blooms, whatever be their thickness. I expected an infernal grating, and I saw machines which cut blocks of steel 30 feet long, with no more noise than is needed to cut cheese. And when I expressed my admiration to the engineer who showed us round, he answered, "A mere question of economy. This machine, that plain steel, has been in use for 42 years. It would not have lasted 10 years if its parts, badly adjusted, interfered, and creaked at each movement of the plane and the blast furnaces. It would be a waste to let heat escape instead of utilizing it. Why roast the founders, when heat lost by radiation represents tons of coal? The stampers that make buildings shake 5 leagues off were also waste. Is it not better to forge by pressure than by impact? And it costs less. There is less loss. In these works, light, cleanliness, the space allotted to each bench, are but a simple question of economy. Work is better done when you can see what you do, and have elbow room. It is true," he said, "we were very cramped before coming here. Land is so expensive in the vicinity of large towns. Landlords are so grasping. It is even so in mines. We know what mines are like nowadays from Zola's descriptions and from newspaper reports. But the mine of the future will be well ventilated, with a temperature as easily regulated as that of a library. There will be no horse doomed to die below the earth. Underground traction will be carried on by means of an automatic cable put into motion at the pit's mouth. Ventilators will be always working, and there will never be explosions. This is no dream. Such a mine is already to be seen in England. I went down it. Here again the excellent organization is simply a question of economy. The mine of which I speak, in spite of its immense depth (466 yards), has an output of 1,000 tons of coal a day, with only 200 miners, 5 tons a day per each worker, whereas the average for 2,000 pits in England at the time I visited this mine in the early 90s was hardly 300 tons a year per man. If necessary, it would be easy to multiply examples proving that as regards the material organization, Fourier's dream was not a utopia. This question has, however, been so frequently discussed in socialist newspapers that public opinion should already be educated on this point. Factory, forge and mine can be as healthy and magnificent as the finest laboratories in modern universities, and the better the organization, the more will men's labor produce. If it be so, can we doubt that work will become a pleasure and a relaxation in a society of equals, in which hands will not be compelled to sell themselves to toil, and to accept work under any conditions? Repugnant tasks will disappear, because it is evident that these unhealthy conditions are harmful to society as a whole. Slaves can submit to them, but free men will create new conditions, and their work will be pleasant and infinitely more productive. The exceptions of today will be the rule of tomorrow. The same will come to pass as regards domestic work, which today's society lays on the shoulders of that drudge of humanity, woman. Part 2. A society regenerated by the Revolution will make domestic slavery disappear. This last form of slavery, perhaps the most tenacious, because it is also the most ancient, only it will not come about in the way dreamt of by phalansterians, nor in the manner often imagined by authoritarian communists. Phalansteries are repugnant to millions of human beings. The most reserved man certainly feels the necessity of meeting his fellows for the purpose of common work, which becomes the more attractive the more he feels himself a part of an immense soul. But it is not so for the hours of leisure, reserved for rest and intimacy. The phalanstery and the familystery do not take this into account, or else they endeavour to supply this need by artificial groupings. A phalanstery, which is in fact nothing but an immense hotel, can please some, and even all at a certain period of their life. But the great mass prefers family life (family life of the future, be it understood). They prefer isolated apartments, Anglo-Saxons even going as far as to prefer houses of from 6 to 8 rooms, in which the family, or an agglomeration of friends, can live apart. Sometimes a phalanstery is a necessity, but it would be hateful were it the general rule. Isolation, alternating with time spent in society, is the normal desire of human nature. This is why one of the greatest tortures in prison is the impossibility of isolation, much as solitary confinement becomes torture in its turn, when not alternated with hours of social life. As to considerations of economy, which are sometimes laid stress on in favour of phalansteries, they are those of a petty tradesman. The most important economy, the only reasonable one, is to make life pleasant for all, because the man who is satisfied with his life produces infinitely more than the man who curses his surroundings. It seems that the communists of young Icaria had understood the importance of a free choice in their daily relations apart from work. The ideal of religious communists has always been to have meals in common. It is by meals in common that early Christians manifested their adhesion to Christianity. Communion is still a vestige of it. Young Icarians had given up this religious tradition. They dined in a common dining room, but at small separate tables, at which they sat according to the attractions of the moment. The communists of Anama have each their house and dine at home, while taking their provisions at will at the communal stores. Other socialists reject the phalanstery, but when you ask them how domestic work can be organized, they answer, each can do his own work. My wife manages the house, the wives of bourgeois will do as much. And if it is a bourgeois playing at socialism who speaks, he will add, with a gracious smile to his wife, is it not true, darling, that you would do without a servant in the socialist society? You would work like the wife of our good comrade Paul, or the wife of John the carpenter? Servant or wife, man always reckons on woman to do the housework. But woman too at last claims her share in the emancipation of humanity. She no longer wants to be the beast of burden of the house. She considers it sufficient work to give many years of her life to the rearing of her children. She no longer wants to be the cook, the mender, the sweeper of the house. And owing to American women taking the lead in obtaining their claims, there is a general complaint of the dearth of women who will condescend to domestic work in the United States. My lady prefers art, politics, literature over gaming tables. As to the work girls, they are few, those who consent to submit to apron slavery, and servants are only found with difficulty in the States. Consequently, the solution, a very simple one, is pointed out by life itself. Machinery undertakes 3/4 of the household cares. You black your boots, and you know how ridiculous this work is. What can be more stupid than rubbing a boot 20 or 30 times with a brush? A tenth of the European population must be compelled to sell itself in exchange for a miserable shelter and insufficient food, and woman must consider herself a slave in order that millions of her sex should go through this performance every morning. But hairdressers have already machines for brushing glossy or woolly heads of hair. Why should we not apply then the same principle to the other extremity? So it has been done, and nowadays the machine for blacking boots is in general use in big American and European hotels. Its use is spreading outside hotels. In large English schools, where the pupils are boarding in the houses of the teachers, it has been found easier to have one single establishment which undertakes to brush 1,000 pairs of boots every morning. As to washing up, where can we find a housewife who has not a horror of this long and dirty work that is usually done by hand, solely because the work of a domestic slave is of no account? In America they do better. There are already a number of cities in which hot water is conveyed to the houses as cold water is in Europe. Under these conditions, the problem was a simple one, and a woman, Mrs. Cochrane, solved it. Her machine washes 12 dozen plates or dishes, wipes them and dries them in less than 3 minutes. A factory in Illinois manufactures these machines and sells them at a price within reach of the average middle-class purse. And why should not small households send their crockery to an establishment as well as their boots? It is even probable that the two functions, brushing and washing up, will be undertaken by the same association. Cleaning, rubbing the skin off your hands when washing and wringing linen, sweeping floors and brushing carpets, thereby raising clouds of dust which afterwards occasion much trouble to dislodge from the places where they have settled down. All this work is still done because woman remains a slave, but it tends to disappear as it can be infinitely better done by machinery. Machines of all kinds will be introduced into households, and the distribution of motor power in private houses will enable people to work them without muscular effort. Such machines cost little to manufacture. If we still pay very much for them, it is because they are not in general use, and chiefly because an exorbitant tax is levied upon every machine by the gentlemen who wish to live in grand style, and who have speculated on land, raw material manufacture, sale, patents and duties. But emancipation from domestic toil will not be brought about by small machines only. Households are emerging from their present state of isolation. They begin to associate with other households to do in common what they did separately. In fact, in the future we shall not have a brushing machine, a machine for washing up plates, a third for washing linen, and so on, in each house. To the future, on the contrary, belongs the common heating apparatus that sends heat into each room of a whole district, and spares the lighting of fires. It is already so in a few American cities. A great central furnace supplies all houses and all rooms with hot water, which circulates in pipes, and to regulate the temperature you need only turn a tap. And you should care to have a blazing fire in any particular room, you can light the gas, especially supplied for heating purposes, from a central reservoir. All the immense work of cleaning chimneys and keeping up fires, and woman knows what time it takes, is disappearing. Candles, lamps, and even gas have had their day. There are entire cities in which it is sufficient to press a button for light to burst forth, and indeed it is a simple question of economy and of knowledge to give yourself the luxury of electric light. And lastly, also in America, they speak of forming societies for the almost complete suppression of household work. It would only be necessary to create a department for every block of houses. A cart would come to each door and take the boots to be blacked, the crockery to be washed up, the linen to be washed, the small things to be mended (open bracket) if it were worthwhile (close bracket), the carpets to be brushed, and the next morning would bring back the things entrusted to it, all well clean. A few hours later, your hot coffee and your eggs, done to a nice tea, would appear on your table. It is a fact that between 12 and 2 o'clock there are more than 20 million Americans, and as many Englishmen, who eat roast beef or mutton, boiled pork, potatoes, and a seasonable vegetable. And at the lowest figure, 8 million fires burn during 2 or 3 hours to roast this meat and cook these vegetables. 8 million women spend their time preparing a meal, which, taking all households, represents at most a dozen different dishes. 50 fires burn, wrote an American woman the other day, where one would suffice. Dine at home at your own table, with your children if you like, but only think yourself, why should these 50 women waste their whole morning to prepare a few cups of coffee and a simple meal? Why 50 fires, when 2 people and 1 single fire would suffice to cook all these pieces of meat and all these vegetables? Choose your own beef or mutton to be roasted if you are particular. Season the vegetables to your taste if you prefer a particular sauce. But have a single kitchen with a single fire, and organize it as beautifully as you are able to. Why has women's work never been of any account? Why in every family are the mother and 3 or 4 servants obliged to spend so much time at what pertains to cooking? Because those who want to emancipate mankind have not included woman in their dream of emancipation, and consider it beneath their superior masculine dignity to think of those kitchen arrangements which they have put on the shoulders of that drudge, woman. To emancipate woman is not only to open the gates of the university, the law courts, or the parliaments to her, for the emancipated woman will always throw her domestic toil onto another woman. To emancipate woman is to free her from the brutalizing toil of kitchen and wash house. It is to organize your household in such a way as to enable her to rear her children, if she be so minded, while still retaining sufficient leisure to take her share of social life. It will come, As we have said, things are already improving. Only let us fully understand that a revolution, intoxicated with the beautiful words liberty, equality, solidarity, would not be a revolution if it maintained slavery at home. Half humanity subjected to the slavery of the half would still have to rebel against the other half. End of Chapter 11 of the Conquest of Bread. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anchor. The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Free Agreement. Part 1. Accustomed as we are, by heredity prejudices and our unsound education and training, to represent ourselves the beneficial hand of government, legislation and magistracy everywhere, we have come to believe that man would tear his fellow man to pieces like a wild beast the day the police took his eye off him, that absolute chaos would come about if authority were overthrown during a revolution, and with our eyes shut we pass by thousands and thousands of human groupings which form themselves freely without any intervention of the law, and attain results infinitely superior to those achieved under governmental tutelage. If you open a daily paper, you find that its pages are entirely devoted to government transactions and to political jobbery. A man from another world, reading it, would believe that, with the exception of the stock exchange transactions, nothing gets done in Europe save by order of some master. You find nothing in the paper about institutions that spring up, grew up, and develop without ministerial prescription. Nothing or almost nothing, even where there is a heading, sundry events, open bracket, faits divers, a favorite column in the French papers, close bracket, it is because they are connected with the police. A family drama and act of rebellion will only be mentioned if the police have appeared on the scene. 350 million Europeans love or hate one another, work or live on their incomes, but apart from literature, theatre or sport, their lives remain ignored by newspapers if governments have not intervened in some way or other. It is even so with history. We know the least details of the life of a king or of a parliament. All good and bad speeches pronounced by the politicians have been preserved. Speeches that have never had the least influence on the vote of a single member, as an old parliamentarian said. Royal visits, the good or bad humour of politicians, their jokes and intrigues are all carefully recorded for posterity. But we have the greatest difficulty to reconstitute a city of the Middle Ages, to understand the mechanism of that immense commerce that was carried on between Hanseatic cities, or to know how the city of Rouen built its cathedral. If a scholar spends his life in studying these questions, his works remain unknown, and parliamentary histories, that is to say the defective ones, as they only treat of one side of social life, multiply. They are circulated, they are taught in schools. In this way we do not even perceive the prodigious work accomplished every day by spontaneous groups of men, which constitutes the chief work of our century. We therefore propose to point out some of these most striking manifestations, and to show how men, as soon as their interests do not absolutely clash, act in concert harmoniously and perform collective work of a very complex nature. It is evident that in present society, based on individual property, that is to say on plunder and on a narrow-minded and therefore foolish individualism, facts of this kind are necessarily limited. Agreements are not always perfectly free, and often they have a mean, if not execrable aim. But what concerns us is not to give examples which might be blindly followed, and which moreover present society could not possibly give us. What we have to do is to show that in spite of the authoritarian individualism which stifles us, there remains in our life, taken as a whole, a very great part in which we only act by free agreement, and that therefore it would be much easier than is usually thought to dispense with government. In support of our view, we have already mentioned railways, and we will now return to them. We know that Europe has a system of railways over 175,000 miles long, and that on this network you can nowadays travel from north to south, from east to west, from Madrid to Petersburg, and from Calais to Constantinople, without delays, without even changing carriages (open bracket) when you travel by express. Close bracket. More than that, a parcel deposited at a station will find its addressee anywhere, in Turkey or in Central Asia, without more formality needed for sending it than writing its destination on a bit of paper. This result might have been obtained in two ways. A Napoleon, a Bismarck, or some potentate having conquered Europe would from Paris, Berlin, or Rome draw a railway map and regulate the hours of the trains. The Russian Tsar, Nicholas I, dreamt of such a power. When he was shown rough drafts of railways between Moscow and Petersburg, he seized a ruler and drew on the top of Russia a straight line between these two capitals, saying, "Here is the plan." And the road was built in a straight line, filling in deep ravines, building bridges of a giddy height which had to be abandoned a few years later after the railway had cost about £120,000 to £150,000 per English mile. This is one way, but happily things were managed differently. Railways were constructed piece by piece, the pieces were joined together, and the 100 different companies, to whom these pieces belonged, gradually came to an understanding concerning the arrival and departure of their trains, and the running of carriages on their rails from all countries, without unloading merchandise as it passes from one network to another. All this was done by free agreement, by exchange of letters and proposals, and by congresses at which delegates met to discuss well-specified special points, and to come to an agreement about them, but not to make laws. After the congress was over, the delegates returned to their respective companies, not with a law, but with a draft of a contract to be accepted or rejected. Of course, difficulties were met in the way. There were obstinate men who would not be convinced, but a common interest compelled them to agree in the end, without invoking the help of armies against the refractory members. This immense network of railways connected together, and the enormous traffic it has given rise to, no doubt constitutes the most striking trait of the 19th century, and it is the result of free agreement. If somebody had foretold it 80 years ago, our grandfathers would have thought him idiotic or mad. They would have said, "Never will you be able to make the shareholders of 100 companies listen to reason. It is a utopia, a fairy tale. A central government with an iron dictator can alone enforce it." And the most interesting thing in this organization is that there is no European central government of railways, nothing. No minister of railway, no dictator, not even a continental parliament, not even a directing committee. Everything is done by free agreement. So we are the believers in the state who pretend that we can never do without a central government. Were it only for regulating the traffic we ask them? But how do European railways manage without them? How do they continue to convey millions of travellers and mountains of luggage across a continent? If companies owning railways have been able to agree, why should railway workers who would take possession of railways not agree likewise? And neither Petersburg-Warsaw Company and that of Paris-Belfort can work in harmony, without giving themselves the luxury of a common commander. Why, in the midst of our societies, consisting of groups of free workers, should we need a government? Part 2. When we endeavour to prove by examples that even today, in spite of the iniquitous organization of society as a whole, men, provided their interests be not diametrically opposed, agree without the intervention of authority, we do not ignore the objections that will be put forth. All such examples have their defective side, because it is impossible to quote a single organization, except from the exploitation of the weak by the strong, the poor by the rich. This is why the statists will not fail to tell us with their wonted logic, "You see that the intervention of the state is necessary to put an end to this exploitation." Only they forget the lessons of history. They do not tell us to what extent the state itself has contributed towards the existing order by creating proletarians and delivering them up to exploiters. They forget to prove us that it is possible to put an end to exploitation, while the primal causes, private capital and poverty, two-thirds of which are artificially created by the state, continue to exist. When we speak of the accord established among the railway companies, we expect them, the worshippers of the bourgeois state, to say to us, "Do you not see how the railway companies oppress and ill-use their employees and their travellers? The only way is that the state should intervene to protect the workers and the public." But have we not said and repeated over and over again that as long as there are capitalists, these abuses of power will be perpetuated? It is precisely the state, the would-be benefactor, that has given to the companies that monopoly and those rights upon us which they possess today. Has it not created concessions, guarantees? Has it not sent its soldiers against railwaymen on strike? And during the first trials, quite lately we saw it still in Russia, has it not extended the privilege of the railway magnates as far as to forbid the press to mention railway accidents, so as not to depreciate the shares it guaranteed? Has it not favoured the monopoly which has anointed the Vanderbilts and the Polyakovs, the directors of the PLM, the CPR, the Saint-Gothard, the kings of our days? Therefore, if we give as an example the tacit agreement come to between railway companies, it is by no means as an ideal of economical management, nor even an ideal of technical organization. It is to show that if capitalists, without any other aim than that of augmenting their dividends, at other people's expense can exploit railways successfully without establishing an international department. Societies of working men will be able to do it just as well and even better without nominating a Ministry of European Railways. Another objection is raised that is more serious at first sight. We may be told that the agreement we speak of is not perfectly free, but the large companies lay down the law to the small ones. It might be mentioned, for example, that a certain rich German company, supported by the state, compelled travelers who go from Berlin to Bâle to pass via Cologne and Frankfurt instead of taking the Leipzig route, or that such a company carries goods 130 miles in a roundabout way (on a long distance) to favor its influential shareholders, and thus ruins the secondary lines. In the United States, travelers and goods are sometimes compelled to travel impossibly circuitous routes so that the dollars may flow into the pocket of a Vanderbilt. Our answer will be the same. As long as capital exists, the greater capital will oppress the lesser. But oppression does not result from capital only. It is also owing to the support given them by the state, to monopoly created by the state in their favor, that the large companies oppress the small ones. The early English and French socialists have shown long since how English legislation did all in its power to ruin the small industries, drive the peasant to poverty, and deliver over to wealthy industrial employers battalions of men compelled to work for no matter what salary. Railway legislation did exactly the same. Strategic lines, subsidized lines, companies which receive the international mail monopoly, everything was brought into play to forward the interests of wealthy financiers. When Rothschild, credited to all European states, puts capital in a railway, his faithful subjects, the ministers, will do their best to make him earn more. In the United States, in the democracy that authoritarians hold up to us as an ideal, the most scandalous fraudulency has crept into everything that concerns railroads. Thus, if a company ruins its competitors by cheap fares, it is often enabled to do so because it is reimbursed by land given to it by the state for a gratuity. Documents recently published concerning the American wheat trade have fully shown up the part played by the state in the exploitation of the weak by the strong. Here too the power of accumulated capital has increased tenfold and 100-fold by means of state help. So what when we see syndicates of railway companies (a product of free agreement) succeeding in protecting the small companies against big ones? We are astonished at the intrinsic force of free agreement that can hold its own against all-powerful capital favoured by the state. It is a fact that little companies exist, in spite of the state's partiality. If in France, land of centralization, we only see 5 or 6 large companies, there are more than 110 in Great Britain, who agree remarkably well, and who are certainly better organized for the rapid transit of travellers and goods than the French and German companies. Moreover, that is not the question. Large capital favoured by the state can always, if it be to its advantage, crush the lesser one. What is of importance to us is this: the agreement between hundreds of capitalist companies, to whom the railways of Europe belong, was established without intervention of a central government to lay down the law to the diverse societies. It has subsisted by means of congresses composed of delegates, who discuss among themselves and submit proposals, not laws, to their constituents. It is a new principle that differs completely from all governmental principle, monarchical or republican, absolute or parliamentarian. It is an innovation that has been timidly introduced into the customs of Europe, but has come to stay. Part 3. How often have we not read in the writings of state-loving socialists? Who then will undertake the regulation of canal traffic in the future society? Should it enter the mind of one of your anarchist comrades to put his barge across a canal and obstruct thousands of boats? Who will force him to reason? Let us confess the supposition to be somewhat fanciful. Still, it might be said, for instance, should a certain commune, or a group of communes, want to make their barges pass before others, they might perhaps block the canal in order to carry stones, while wheat, needed in another commune, would have to stand by. Who then would regulate the traffic if not the government? But real life has again demonstrated that government can be very well dispensed with here as elsewhere. Free agreement, free organization replace that noxious and costly system, and do better. We know what canals mean to Holland. They are its highways. We also know how much traffic there is on the canals. What is carried along our highroads and railroads is transported on canal boats in Holland. There you could find cause to fight, in order to make your boats pass before others. There the government might really interfere to keep the traffic in order. Yet it is not so. The Dutch settled matters in a more practical way, long ago by founding guilds or syndicates of boatmen. These were free associations sprung from the very needs of navigation. The right of way for the boats was adjusted by the order of inscription in a navigation register. They had to follow one another in turn. Nobody was allowed to get ahead of the others, under pain of being excluded from the guild. None could station more than a certain number of days along the quay, and if the owner found no goods to carry during that time, so much the worse for him. He had to depart with his empty barge to leave room for newcomers. Obstruction was thus avoided, even though the competition between the private owners of the boats continued to exist. Were the latter suppressed, the agreement would have been only the more cordial. It is unnecessary to add that the ship owners could adhere or not to the syndicate. That was their business, but most of them elected to join it. Moreover, these syndicates offered such great advantages that they spread also along the Rhine, the Weser, the Oder, and as far as Berlin. The boatmen did not wait for a great Bismarck to annex Holland to Germany, and to appoint an Oberhauptgeneral Staatskanal Navigationsrath (Supreme Head Councillor of the General States Canal Navigation), with a number of gold stripes on his sleeves corresponding to the length of the title. They preferred coming to an international understanding. Besides, a number of ship owners whose sailing vessels ply between Germany and Scandinavia, as well as Russia, have also joined these syndicates in order to regulate traffic in the Baltic and to bring about a certain harmony in the chassé-croisé of vessels. These associations have sprung up freely, recruiting volunteer adherents, and have naught in common with governments. It is, however, more than probable that here too greater capital oppresses lesser. Maybe the syndicate has also a tendency to become a monopoly, especially where it receives the precise patronage of a state that surely did not fail to interfere with it. Let us not forget either that these syndicates represent associations whose members have only private interests at stake, and that if at the same time each ship owner were compelled by the socializing of production, consumption and exchange to belong to federated communes, or to 100 other associations for the satisfying of his needs, things would have a different aspect. A group of ship owners powerful on sea would feel weak on land, and they would be obliged to lessen their claims in order to come to terms with railways, factories and other groups. At any rate, without discussing the future, here is another spontaneous association that has dispensed with government. Let us quote more examples. As we are talking of ships and boats, let us mention one of the most splendid organizations that the 19th century has brought forth, one of those we may with right be proud of, the English Lifeboat Association. It is known that every year more than 1,000 ships are wrecked on the shores of England. At sea, a good ship seldom fears a storm. It is near the coast that danger threatens. Rough seas that shatter her stern posts, squalls that carry off her masts and sails, currents that render her unmanageable, reefs and sandbanks on which she runs aground. Even in olden times, when it was a custom among inhabitants of the coast to light fires in order to attract themselves onto reefs, in order to plunder their cargoes, they always strove to save their crew. Seeing a ship in distress, they launched their boats and went to the rescue of shipwrecked sailors, only too often finding a watery grave themselves. Every hamlet along the seashore has its legends of heroism, displayed by women as well as by men, to save crews in distress. No doubt the state and men of science have done something to diminish the number of casualties. Lighthouses, signals, charts, meteorological warnings have diminished them greatly, but there remains 1,000 ships and several thousand human lives to be saved every year. To this end, a few men of good will put their shoulders to the wheel. Being good sailors and navigators themselves, they invented a lifeboat that could weather a storm without being torn to pieces or capsizing, and they set to work to interest the public in their venture, to collect the necessary funds for constructing boats and for stationing them along the coast, wherever they could be of use. These men, not being Jacobins, did not turn to the government. They understood that to bring the enterprise to a successful issue, they must have the cooperation, the enthusiasm, the local knowledge, and especially the self-sacrifice of the local sailors. They also understood that to find men who at the first signal would launch their boat at night in a chaos of waves, not suffering themselves to be deterred by darkness or breakers, and struggling 5, 6, 10 hours against the tide before reaching a vessel in distress, men ready to risk their lives to save those of others, there must be a feeling of solidarity, a spirit of sacrifice, not to be bought with galloon. It was therefore a perfectly spontaneous movement, sprung from agreement and individual initiative. Hundreds of local groups arose along the coast. The initiators had the common senses not to pose as masters. They looked for sagacity in the fishermen's hamlets, and when a rich man sent £1,000 to a village on the coast to erect a lifeboat station, and his offer was accepted, he left the choice of a site to the local fishermen and sailors. Models of new boats were not submitted to the Admiralty. We read in a report of the association, "As it is of importance that lifeboatmen should have full confidence in the vessel they man, the committee will make a point of constructing and equipping the boats according to the lifeboatmen's express wish. In consequence, every year brings with it new improvements. The work is wholly conducted by volunteers organizing in committees and local groups, by mutual aid and agreement, through anarchists. Moreover, they ask nothing of the ratepayers, and in a year they may receive £40,000 in spontaneous subscriptions." As to the results, here they are. In 1891 the association possessed 293 lifeboats. The same year it saved 601 shipwrecked sailors and 33 vessels. Since its foundation it has saved 32,671 human beings. In 1886 3 lifeboats, with all their men having perished at sea, hundreds of new volunteers entered their names, organized themselves into local groups, and the agitation resulted in the construction of 20 additional boats. As we proceed, let us note that every year the association sends to the fishermen and sailors excellent barometers at a price 3 times less than their sale price in private shops. It propagates meteorological knowledge and warns the parties concerned of the sudden changes of weather predicted by men of science. Let us repeat that these hundreds of committees and local groups are not organized hierarchically, and are composed exclusively of volunteers, lifeboatmen, and people interested in the work. The Central Committee, which is more of a centre for correspondence, in no wise interferes. It is true that when a voting on some question of education or local taxation takes place in a district, these committees of the National Lifeboat Association do not, as such, take part in the deliberations, a modesty which unfortunately the members of elected bodies do not imitate. But on the other hand, these brave men do not allow those who have never faced a storm to legislate for them about saving life. At the first signal of distress, they rush to their boats and go ahead. There are no embroidered uniforms, but much goodwill. Let us take another society of the same kind, that of the Red Cross. The name matters little. Let us examine it. Imagine somebody saying 50 years ago, "The state, capable as it is of massacring 20,000 men in a day, and of wounding 50,000 more, is incapable of helping its own victims. Consequently, as long as war exists, private initiative must intervene, and men of goodwill must organize internationally for this human work." What mockery would not have met the man who would have dared to speak thus? To begin with, he would have been called a utopian, and if that did not silence him, he would have been told, "What nonsense! Your volunteers will be found wanting precisely where they are most needed. Your volunteer hospitals will be centralized in a safe place, while everything will be wanting in the ambulances." Utopians like you forget the national rivalries which will cause the poor soldiers to die without any help. Such disheartening remarks would have only been equalled by the number of speakers. Who of us has not heard men hold forth in this strain? Now we know what happened. Red Cross societies organized themselves freely everywhere in all countries, in thousands of localities, and when the war of 1871 broke out, the volunteers set to work. Men and women offered their services. Thousands of hospitals and ambulances were organized. Trains were started carrying ambulances, provisions, linen, and medicaments for the wounded. The English committees sent entire convoys of food, clothing, tools, grain to sow, beasts of draught, even steam plough, with their attendants to help in the tillage of departments devastated by the war. Only consult La Croix Rouge by Gustave Moignet, and you will be really struck by the immensity of the work performed. As to the prophets ever ready to deny other men's courage, good sense and intelligence, and believing themselves to be the only ones capable of ruling the world with a rod, none of their predictions were realized. The devotion of the Red Cross volunteers was beyond all praise. They were only too eager to occupy the most dangerous posts, and whereas the salaried doctors of the Napoleonic state fled with their staff when the Prussians approached, the Red Cross volunteers continued their work under fire, enduring the brutalities of Bismarck's and Napoleon's officers, lavishing their care on the wounded of all nationalities. Dutch, Italians, Swedes, Belgians, even Japanese and Chinese agreed remarkably well. They distributed their hospitals and their ambulances according to the needs of the occasion. They vied with one another, especially in the hygiene of their hospitals, and there is many a Frenchman who still speaks with deep gratitude of the tender care he received from the Dutch or German volunteers in the Red Cross ambulances. But what is this to an authoritarian? His ideal is the regiment doctor, salaried by the state. What does he care for the Red Cross and its hygienic hospitals, if the nurses be not functionaries? Here is then an organization, sprung up but yesterday, and which reckons its members by hundreds of thousands, possesses ambulances, hospital trains, elaborates new processes for treating wounds, and so on, and is due to the spontaneous initiative of a few devoted men. Perhaps we shall be told that the state has something to do with this organization. Yes, states have laid hands on it to seize it. The directing committees are presided over by those whom flunkies, called princes of the blood, emperors and queens, lavishly patronize the national committees. But it is not to this patronage that the success of the organization is due. It is to the thousand local committees of each nation, to the activity of individuals, to the devotion of all those who try to help the victims of war. And this devotion would be far greater if the state did not meddle with it. In any case, it was not by the order of an international directing committee that Englishmen and Japanese, Swedes and Chinamen bestirred themselves to send help to the wounded in 1871. It was not by order of an international ministry that hospitals rose on the invaded territory and that ambulances were carried on to the battlefield. It was by the initiative of volunteers from each country. Once on the spot, they did not get hold of one another by the hair, as was foreseen by the Jacobinists of all nations. They all set to work without distinction of nationality. We may regret that such great efforts should be put to the service of so bad a cause, and we may ask ourselves, like the poet's child, why inflict wounds if you are to heal them afterwards? In striving to destroy the power of capitalist and middle-class authority, we work to put an end to the massacres called wars, and we would further rather see the Red Cross volunteers put forth their activity to bring about (with us) the suppression of war, but we had to mention this immense organization as another illustration of results produced by free agreement and free aid. If we wish to multiply examples taken from the art of exterminating men, we should never end. Suffice to quote the numerous societies to which the German army owes its force. That does not only depend on discipline, as is generally believed. I mean the societies whose aim is to propagate military knowledge. At one of the last congresses of the Military Alliance (Kriegerbund), delegates from 2,452 federated societies comprising 151,712 members were present, but there are besides very numerous shooting, military games, strategical games, topographical studies societies. These are the workshops in which the technical knowledge of the German army is developed, not in regimental schools. It is a formidable network of all kinds of societies, including military men and civilians, geographers and gymnasts, sportsmen and technologists, which rise up spontaneously, organize, federate, discuss and explore the country. It is these voluntary and free associations that go to make the real backbone of the German army. Their aim is execrable. It is the maintenance of the empire. But what concerns us is to point out that, in spite of military organization being the great mission of the state, success in this branch is the more certain the more it is left to the free agreement of groups and to the free initiative of individuals. Even in matters pertaining to war, free agreement is thus appealed to, and to further prove our assertion, let us mention the Volunteer Topographers' Corps of Switzerland, who study in detail the mountain passages, the Aeroplane Corps of France, the 300,000 British volunteers, the British National Artillery Association, and the society now in course of organization for the defense of England's coast, as well as the appeals made to the commercial fleet, the bicyclist corps, and the new organizations of private motor cars and steam launches. Everywhere the state is abdicating and abandoning its holy functions to private individuals. Everywhere free organization trespasses on its domain. And yet the facts we have quoted give us only a glimpse of what free government has in store for us in the future, when there will be no more state.